So you might have heard Jeff joke last week when he heard the title of my sermon today that he hoped the answer was yes, because we're really close to Christmas. And it's a little late to maybe switch to something else. But I wanted to offer some alternatives just to get right out in front of it. So this is a depiction from the Middle Ages of Yule. So Yule tide, Yule logs. This is a Germanic holiday that predated Christmas. It's a pre-Christian holiday. It's a little heavy on the skulls and the sacrifice and the blood side of things. So that's some downsides to adopting it with your family this year. On the bright side, the Church of Satan now celebrates Yule, so you won't be celebrating it alone if you choose that. There was an attempt a few years ago to create a secular alternative to Christmas. It was called Human Light. And when you look at this really amazing graphic with it's got a font, it's got many colors, it's really hard to believe that Human Light didn't catch on. But if you're looking for something bland and insipid with your family, Human Light's an alternative. But myself, if the answer to this question turns out to be no, I'm celebrating Festivus. For those of you under a certain age, you might not remember this from Seinfeld, but I think that there's plenty of reason for us to be airing grievances this year and enjoying meatloaf together. So, just in case the message here is not convincing, those are some alternatives for you and your family. And we're going to read again a little bit of what was there in the Advent reading from Luke 2. An angel of the Lord appeared to the shepherds, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord." So in thinking about, is there some common ground for us, at least as Americans, of what we can agree is good? Naturally, I went to the survey data. So about 10 years ago, there was a survey of Americans asking for favorability ratings on some of our most famous people. This is of the top 6. This is the bottom 3. Martin Luther King certainly was favorable. He's no Aaron Rodgers by any stretch of the imagination. I would say that if this survey was run again today, 10 years later, I feel like recently Aaron Rodgers is on his way down. I feel like Martin Luther King Jr. is probably on his way up. But I'd also like to acknowledge Jesus Christ for coming in. Not quite at the top on the survey, but pretty high. I mean, pretty good. We can build off of this kind of branding with Jesus at 90%. Anyone want to guess what's one step above this?
Boris Johnson.
Michelle Obama.
Oh, good guess.
Yeah.
It is a politician, but it's Abraham Lincoln. And so, congratulations to Abraham on being out the King of Kings. That's a good showing for Abraham. And then, of course, there's going to be at the very top of our list. And once you hear it, you will know that is correct. Anyone want to guess what this top one is? Most favorable ratings of Americans?
Walt Disney Rod.
Santa.
Myself. And that seems exactly right. Like, my rating of myself is absolutely up there. I think we're ready to start with the new Mount Rushmore that has Aaron Rodgers, Jesus, Abraham Lincoln, and myself. That's going to be like a perfect Mount Rushmore of approval. So, hearing the topic of the message today, is Christianity good? You may ask whether that's an important or a pressing question, or is it as important as the question of, is Christianity true? And today I'm going to separate out those two questions of whether Christianity is good from whether Christianity is true. Because I think that they ask very kind of different things about what Christianity means in the world, what Jesus means in the world. But it's not to say the question of, is Christianity true, is not important, because it's arguably the most important question of our lives. But the fact is that there can be things that are good but not true, and there can be things that are true but not good. So, for example, of something that may be good but is not true, think of the optimism of someone who's dying from an incurable disease, telling themselves, I'm going to make it through, things are going to be okay. That might not be true, and yet in this last part of their lives, they may enjoy that last part of their life more than they would have if they did not believe that thing that was false. They may even live longer because of that optimism and the physical effect that has on them. So that's something that may not be true, but it still could be good for them. At the same time, there are things that are true but might not be good. I think that we have on pretty wide attestation that the most amazing feeling in the entire world is the first time that opium enters your bloodstream. And all of your cares and all of your anxieties and all of your frustrations and disappointments, they just float away from you. And the peace and pleasure and just disconnection from all the stress that you will feel in that moment is like nothing that you will ever experience in your entire life. But that may be true, but that doesn't make it good. And I think that in time we see more and more clearly what exactly the implications are of taking on something like that. That may be true, but it's not good. And I think this distinction between what's good and what's true, it goes back from as long as Christians have been trying to think clearly about these things. Thomas Aquinas making this same point, that they're not interchangeable because some things are true and not good. So in order to think about this question, we have to think a little bit about definitions here. What does it mean for something to be good? And we also have to entertain some counterfactuals and think about, what if things were different? What would that look like for us? And so let's start with that question of what's good. And I think that when we think about what is good in our lives and in the world, there's two main categories of answer to that. I think the first one, and this is the one that I associate with like the history of philosophy, with like Platonic thinking, is that there are these abstractions that are admirable and honorable and good for some reason that are a way of articulating what's good. So some of those things are just existence itself, life, order and harmony, beauty, peace. All these things, they're abstractions, but we do recognize them in an important way. Yeah, that's something that is good. However, there's another set of things, which I think are probably more common how we articulate what it means, what goodness means now, which is about human flourishing. So it's less about some abstract ideal that maybe we can conform our lives more or less to, but it's more about, are people thriving, right? Like that's what flourishing means to most people now. So by that, we could be talking about freedom, we could be talking about well-being or happiness, we could be talking about maybe it's community or relationship, skillfulness, being good at what you do. All those things are examples of things that are human flourishing, and those are ways of answering what's good. So I think, though, that both of these categories of things have some limitations to them. These admirable abstractions, they feel pretty far removed from our lives. Like when we're in the daily grind of making our decisions, doing our lives, it doesn't, at least for us today, it doesn't really make sense to think about, seeking peace and order in our lives. It's more we're just trying to get through the decisions that are in front of us. So they seem so abstracted and far off. But those ideals of human flourishing, like freedom and happiness and well-being, those things change over time. They can conflict with each other, and they very much suffer from the blind spots of the age that we live in now. And I think that those blind spots to some extent change over time because different societies have different presuppositions about what goodness means for people. But a lot of conflicts arise if we make that as the center of what we think about the good. So when we talk about whether Christianity is good, there's different ways of asking the same question. And the first way is Christianity good for the world? Now, here, of course, again, I'm separating whether it's true from whether it's good. And so the only fair kind of evidence that we can put into this question is, what do we see in the world, the measurable world around us? And what does that tell us about Christianity? And it may seem like kind of a difficult question for us to ask ourselves, but it's a question the Bible requires of us, in fact. In 1 Peter writes, "Live such good lives among the pagans that, although they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." That's a really high standard for the sort of goodness that Christianity should be bringing. Or Paul in Ephesians 2 writing, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." So it seems like these are questions that are very reasonable to be asking, whether Christianity is and has been good in the world. Around 10 or 15 years ago, there was a whole bunch of anti-theist books that came out. You probably remember this. There was Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris and all these books about why religion poisons everything and all the listing of the historical crimes of people who are believers. And For the most part, I think that most of the critiques of historical Christianity fell under these categories of things. One is that religion or Christianity specifically represented a constraint on science and progress, that it encouraged escapism and distraction from the real world problems that people should be addressing, that Christians put God's stamp of approval on things that were repressive practices because, hey, this is what God is commanding us to do. And of course, there's some specific incidents with the Crusades, with Inquisitions. And I think what a lot of these critiques of historical Christianity have in common is that they really came out at times when there's association of Christianity with power and authority. That's the common thread with these critiques. And I think all of them I'd be interested to discuss specifically at length because there's a lot to say and there's a lot that we presuppose about these things that might or might not be true. But if I'm going to take a secular anti-theist ledger, I think these are the things that show up on that side. We don't think as much about the things that show up on the other side, but there are things on the other side too. So if you look at the history of Christianity over the last 2,000 years, you see, among other things, the organized service to the poor of all religions. And that's going all the way back to the first 200 years of the church, with the Roman emperors complaining that the impious Christians are taking care of our poor as well as their own. And it goes all the way into what my career is today, extending grace and mercy to people in all corners of the world. And that's absolutely a legacy of the last 2,000 years. There's the end of human sacrifice in whatever societies that Christianity has encountered. There's the establishment of the first universities and hospitals, almost always in religious contexts, almost always specifically with Christian movements. There is soaring and distinctive art, music, architecture, literature that is incredible over the history. And we don't have Bach, we don't have Dostoevsky, we don't have Gaudi. Think of all these incredible and powerful and moving artists that we would not have if it was not for the worldly movement of Christianity. On top of that, there's about 7,100 languages in the world. Of them, about 1,600 of them now have a copy of the New Testament in their native language. And there is another 1,500 or so in preparation of translations happening. The reason that these languages are being written down at all is because Christian missionaries are doing it. These languages would be disappearing if that was not the case. It's the effort of people who are translators, who are writing these languages down for the first time in many cases. And this confirmation to people that this language that you were born with, it matters, and God is speaking to you in it, that's a product of the Christian missionary movement. On top of that, a lot of things that we simply, in America, we simply take as like the baseline understanding of human rights and human dignity and human freedom, all those are inspired either directly by Christianity or coming out of Christian and post-Christian societies. The idea of the dignity of individuals, the movement for the abolition of slavery, individual freedoms, these things also came out of Christianity's recent history in the world. But that doesn't feel like evidence exactly. I think that we can recognize this as being good and powerful things, but if you're in the modern academic world anyway, when you think of evidence, you think of something more specific and measurable and repeatable, and that's what you want to look at. And we're going to look at that briefly because there's a lot of people asking the question of, is religion good, or is Christianity good in the world? And I have to offer a disclaimer before we go too deeply here, because the fact of the matter is, when you hear the expression, a study has proven, or a study has shown that, in most cases that's probably false, or unclear at best. So recently there was an effort to replicate social science findings over the past 20 or 30 years, like the most important social science papers finding things about human behavior. They ran 100 of these experiments back again. People repeating the experiments only replicated the actual result 50% of the time. So in fact, people speak sometimes with certainty about things that don't have that much certainty behind them. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the people who are researching these questions, who are trying to tackle these questions, they come in with their own biases. They frame the question in a way that will get the most interesting answer that they sometimes want to hear, which sways the findings. There are these variables that they don't understand. And all of us can succumb to selective rigor and selective framing for the results that we care about or the results that we want to see. That's not to say that none of these studies are valuable, because I think they are, but anyone individually we have to take with a grain of salt, and what we should be paying most attention to is what's the weight of the evidence? Do we have a lot of different studies in different places showing the same kinds of things, as opposed to one study showing one exciting thing? Because that one study that shows one exciting thing, we're going to want to exaggerate the effects. The media will pick it up because it's an exciting and interesting story. People want to click on things that are interesting, so it will be shared on your social media. But that doesn't mean necessarily that those things are true. That said, there are some really interesting findings from more recent studies of the impact of Christianity in the world. One of them is that there is a lasting impact on people's educational attainment if there was missionary activity specifically in the area where they are. This effect has been shown in many countries to last even past 100 years, that educational attainment is higher. Another is with economic self-improvement. There's lots of evidence from different models that when there are evangelical values that are part of people's overall program of development, that their lives develop more quickly and their income grows. So not only this study in the Philippines that you see cited here, but also I'm familiar with at World Vision a program called Biblically Empowered Worldview. And we find that when we have this worldview program and we attach it to our economic development work, that people's incomes actually grow faster when they're also having the Christian training as well. And where that comes from is that people, as part of that training, recognize themselves as being created by God to do positive things in their lives and the world, and to do those good works. And that turns out to be really inspiring and powerful for people's lives. Crime, disorder, drunkenness. There's a study in Wales that showed that when revival happened, drunkenness went down, violence against spouses went down, crime went down. So this was an effect that these things got better when there was revival happening, and when the revival died out, things got worse again. It was a really clear demonstration of a practical improvement in people's lives. And then these last two are probably, I would say, the best attested of this list here, because we see them in all kinds of studies. One of them is that with personal generosity and engaging in the world, highly religious people are far more likely to be generous, and generous at higher levels, generous with their time and with their money. And that generosity includes not only giving to religious causes, but secular causes as well. And we've seen this in a number of studies asking the question a lot of different ways. And then finally, subjective well-being and life satisfaction. You know, these are these ideals of human flourishing that dominate our idea of what's good now. Well, we consistently see that the most committed believers have happier, less anxious, and more meaning-filled lives. Now, that doesn't mean if you are feeling anxious or not feeling happy that you're doing something wrong, but that is to say that there's a measurable difference in people's self-reported quality of life when they're serious believers. So these are all really practical things. And to sum it up, this is a quote from arguably, I would say, one of our foremost public intellectuals who probably none of you have heard of. His name is Tyler Cowen. He's an economist. And he wrote this: "Religion is underrated. America is becoming more secular. I believe that this is part of our social breakdown. And as conditions become more volatile, we will need some kinds of religion more than in the last 10 or 20 years. Religion gives you community. It gives you comfort. It hedges risk. It gives you a faith in the future. You believe in something greater and more glorious than yourself. The more volatile our times, the more useful that is." So a good question to answer after hearing some of this is that compelling? Is that enough? And the reason I quoted Tyler Cowen there is that for him, it's not. He's not a Christian. He's not a believer. He believes strongly in the utilitarian argument that Christianity is good for people and that religion is good for Americans, but he himself is not a believer. And the evidence question for him about the goodness of it is for him separate with the truth question. And I think that that's an important point that we'll circle back to. Another way of asking the question of, is Christianity good, is it better than whatever the alternative will be? And there's a lot of ways of looking at that question. There's ways that when we can look at societies before and after Christianity is growing, whether because it's replacing pagan religions, or whether because it's a time of revival or replacing secularization. Or you can look at places that are becoming less Christian, either because they're secularizing or they're converting to a different religion. Those are some of the ways we can think about this. And I'll just quickly say now that in the United States, we talked about recently, we're in an era of secularization right now. And I think that we are starting to see some practical examples of some differences that are coming with secularization. One of them is, think of the modern Black Lives Matter movement and the contrast between that and the civil rights movement that was led mostly by black pastors, and some of the differences that we felt and perceived there when religion was not at the forefront of that movement. Or looking at a different angle entirely, think of our first encounters with the post-religious right and what the right looks like in this country separated from faith. Because I think that we're starting to see that now, and people who have been really unhappy with the religious right in this country may be kind of shocked by what will replace it. So from our own context, I think that those are the kinds of questions that we can ask that build into our body of thought here. But I still feel like we haven't asked any really important questions of ourselves, and that's where these questions land the most. And another way of asking that is our third form of the question of, is Christianity good for me? Separate from whether it's good for you, I have a lot of perspective about myself on this. And I have a sample size of 1. I'm terribly biased. I am absolutely prone to exaggerate the effects here. I have all those things that you want to take with a grain of salt. I think I'm subject to them. And yet I wrestle with this all the time, and I have insights about myself that I will never have about anyone else because of that. And I want to just highlight some of those things. Like, if I think of this counterfactual world of myself without Jesus here on earth, who am I? And what are some of the differences? Here's a few things. You know the marshmallow experiment where they take like a 6-year-old kid and they put him in a room, they put a marshmallow in front of them, and then they say, that marshmallow is still there in 5 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. Then they walk out of the room and they see if the kid will eat the 1 marshmallow or if they can hold on and get 2 marshmallows. I'm a 1 marshmallow person deep down. When it comes to like the pleasures and the good things in my life, I really want them now, and I want to enjoy them now. That's my nature. And the force in my life that's pushing me to think about the long-term effects, being able to delay gratification, being able to take the long view about the things that might feel good in the moment, but might have some real negative implications for myself, really that's Christianity pushing me to the longest term thinking about the things that I enjoy. So I think that that's a way that I'd be different without Jesus. Another really practical one is a prompt toward generosity. I don't see myself as a very generous person by default, but constantly being challenged by the Bible's call to care for the poor, both in the Old Testament and with Christ in the New Testament, that deeply impacts my decisions and my thinking about just sharing with others. I think without Christianity, I'd be missing a lot of the tools that help make me a better husband and father. Although I'm not a perfect one, I think that my patience and compassion and interest in connecting and caring, again, is tied very much to the call that I feel on me as a Christian. Like, I can't envision myself in quite the same way as a parent without it. If you know me well, you might know that deep down I'm a pretty sharp-tongued and cynical person. And I really kind of enjoy indulging that. I like getting in a sharp word. And there's something condescending and demeaning about that side of my personality. And it doesn't come out very often. But I think the reason it doesn't come out very often is because I believe it shouldn't. Because I feel the call of Christ that it shouldn't. And just indulging that tongue and indulging that side of myself is something that I would see more of. And these last two come together here. I'm someone who has periodically struggled with anxiety in my life, and having a sense of hope and purpose about the future acts in opposition to that. And Tim Keller wrote something recently which really landed for me in thinking about hope and purpose. He said, 3 things Christians believe that should be a constant source of happiness. Our bad things will turn out for good. The good things we have can never be taken away from us. And the best things are yet to come. And the me that lives without Jesus says no to all those 3 things. I do not believe that my bad things will turn out for good. I do not believe that the good things I have cannot be taken away from me. In fact, all the time I'm stressed thinking about how good things I have could be taken away from me. And I don't believe that the best things are yet to come. That's not in my nature. I'm 44. It doesn't really get better from here. Right? So the point here is that my cynicism and my cold realism is directly impacted by the way that I think about Christianity. But I think when people ask the question of whether Christianity is good, they're really thinking of something or someone specific, some event in their lives, some idea that they really hate. It's really the problem of bad Christianity that's driving how people think about that. And so when we look not historically at what Christianity has done over 2,000 years, but today, what is Christianity representing and doing? I think there's a few areas that people really object to it. One of them is around ethics, that Christianity comes with some sets of rules and guidelines, and those rules impede human freedom or they limit human pleasure. The principle that everyone should get to do and be exactly what they are on the inside, that's a really strong one as our culture is secularizing. And there are bumpers in place for people who are trying to be Christians, and that's uncomfortable, and we don't like it. Without going into depth here, I think that it's far from clear that the more freedom we have, like the better we turn out. I think that there's lots of evidence against that, actually, that in fact, there are a lot of forms of freedom that are way more likely that we bring harm to ourselves and to others. But that's a different sermon. But just to say that I think that's a common objection. I think there's also an aesthetic objection, which is that it's kind of old and tired and okay, we've done that. And maybe there's some beautiful old churches, but all right, we've moved on from that. It's concerned about things that don't matter. And the aesthetic critique doesn't really land for me, because when I look at the things that are trying hardest to be modern and current, those are the things that feel kind of blandest to me of all, as opposed to the things that are tying us together, as Bill said, across thousands of years through this past history and these current connections with believers. Those things to me are much more aesthetically rich. There's theological objections, that there are statements in Christianity about the nature of God that are offensive. So maybe that's around the Trinity. How can God be three and yet one? That's a difficulty that people struggle with. Or maybe it's about sin and judgment and separation. Those are uncomfortable things for us. But the one that really hits home the most, I think, is hypocrisy. The idea that the adherents, or at least some adherents of Christianity, are not Christ-like, and that they use Christianity to manipulate others and to justify bad behavior. And that's the one, when I hear it, I'm like, yeah, that's the one that really feels most relevant right now. And it feels loud too. Like I wanted to put it in all caps and say, Christians are bad and their ideas are bad and they're not nice. And I think there's two ways of answering this, and there's some philosophical points about this, and there's some really practical points. And I want to start on the philosophical side. And the first is that badness is everywhere, while that accusation about bad Christianity is very selective. Anyone who's pointing out the badness of Christians or Christianity, if they were subjected in the groups they identify themselves with or in their own lives, if we were careful scrutiny of those people, we would find badness there. Because badness isn't unique to Christians. Badness is something about the condition that all of us are in. So it feels a little strange to me that that accusation is just selective when in fact it could be applied everywhere. C.S. Lewis says, he talks about nice people versus new men. And he says this: it's not really fair to ask, well, do the existence of mean Christians, does that disprove Christianity? Or does the existence of nice people who aren't Christians, does that disprove Christianity? He says, you have no idea how much meaner that mean person would be if they weren't a believer. You don't know how much nicer that nice person would be if they were. That's a counterfactual question, right? On top of that, though, I would say that if Christianity was only nice people, I think I would be a lot more suspicious of whether it was true. Because, in fact, we are born with different inclinations and different moods and different personalities. And we should expect that there should be a lot of divergence in sort of our basic moods among people who are believers. Next point is this. If you believe in badness, you know something about the meaning of the universe. So, someone who is throwing an accusation of people being bad or hypocritical, note some of the things that are implied by that. One is that there is such a thing as a good and a bad, and it's out there, and it's separate from us from people, and we have the ability as individuals to choose one way or the other, that we can act in that world, and that there should be consequences if we don't choose the right way. We're already halfway to theism, if you think about it, when you frame it that way. People who are eager to point out the badness of people or badness of Christianity are halfway to the finish line already, just by recognizing that there's a standard outside of themselves, and that we're failing to meet that standard. But here's where we get from a philosophical reply into a more Christian answer. And that's that the accusation, I believe, that some Christians are bad, that accusation doesn't go far enough. There was a article in a paper in England about 100 years ago asking the question, what is wrong with society? And the author, G.K. Chesterton, wrote in, and he gave this answer, "Dear sir, I am." And so when I say this criticism doesn't go far enough, I think that when we hear the accusation that bad Christians are bad, our reply actually ought to be that I am bad in particular. Not just people in general, but me. That I am the person who is bad, that I am the person that does not do the things that I should be doing, that does do things I shouldn't be doing. That's me. That's not bad people, that's not bad Christians, it's me specifically. And we have to land on something really practical here, which is that hypocrisy, when it's called out, boy, that's something pretty close to the Spirit of Christ. Because if you look at the New Testament, Jesus has so much kindness and gentleness for people of ill repute and people who are doing bad things and people who are lost and people who are broken. But wow, he has some hard words for the religious leaders. And he has some hard words for people who are being hypocritical. And here I am today preaching, and I was thinking about that. Yikes, because this puts me right in this dead bullseye of hypocrisy. For saying one thing and doing a different thing. And there should be so much humility for us in that when we see what Christ's worldly encounter with hypocrisy was, how he felt about it. But I would challenge us on top of that, it's not just about conceding or rooting out hypocrisy among other people when we find it. It's really about identifying it in ourselves, much more than finding it in other people. And of course, this is in keeping with you hypocrite, take the log out of your own eye before you take out the speck from your brother or sister's eye. Like that's the spirit of that hypocrisy. But when we hear that, we should probably hate hypocrisy. Not probably. We should hate hypocrisy more than people who declaim it in us, who aren't believers. We should be just as passionate to root it out, but especially in ourselves. And that should be something that, in humility, should just give us a lot of quietness and an accusation of hypocrisy. And the second really practical point is this one. What is ultimately convincing? I feel like I could make a really strong, long intellectual argument about goodness and badness or about hypocrisy. But in fact, it's probably not going to win people. Even your conversation at the dinner table, let alone your message, your thread on the message board, you're not going to win that way. What ultimately is convincing and transformational for people is how we live our lives. And that's the most practical, real-world, flesh and blood expression of a response to hypocrisy. Because people who are actually in our midst and sharing our lives with us will have a very different impression from what they hear in sort of some ethereal and abstract way. And the reason why is because they're encountering Christ, because Christ is working through us. And that's how we be gospel forward in responding to hypocrisy, is that we live out our most convincing lives in how we treat each other, and how we admit hypocrisy, and how we admit our failures, and how we share love with others. As we end here, I want to turn back to the moment where the angels are appearing to the shepherds. What's happening here is a very different shape of goodness than what we're used to seeing, and I want to highlight a couple of those ways. Here they are, they're terrified, and the angel is saying, "Don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah. There's a few things about this kind of goodness. This is a really hopeful one for me. You know, in the gospel story, in the story of the incarnation, there are a lot of people who are waiting, right? So, you know, Mary was waiting, Elizabeth was waiting, you have Simeon in the temple waiting, who we'll meet later. There's lots of people who are waiting. But there's also people who are not waiting, like the shepherds. The shepherds are just at work. Like, they're literally just watching sheep. They're not there to wait for the Messiah. If they have any sense of it at all, it's maybe some sort of political sense of being freed from the yoke of Rome, to the extent that they have any kind of thought about it at all. But they're not waiting. And to me, there's a lot of hope in that, because this is a great illustration of the good news not depending on us. We don't have to qualify for it by waiting, or to qualify it any other way. And to me, that's really hopeful, that it's not just the ones who are actively waiting, but the ones who have their lives interrupted by this visitation, that it's for them too, even if they weren't waiting. I think a second point about this goodness is that at first, it doesn't look like winning. And, you know, we've talked before about how in the incarnation, the idea of the Messiah was supposed to be this worldly, powerful, justice-bringing leader. And in the end of days, he is that. But in the short term, with how he appeared at Christmas, it didn't look like winning. I don't think a lot of us look at a tiny, helpless baby in a barn and think of victory, and think of triumph, and think of crashing down our enemies. And yet, this is how Christ appears to us in this form that is so weak and helpless. And I love how that both subverts our expectations. Like, that's not what we would expect from God's appearance in the universe. And yet there's a goodness that I can sense there, that I feel there in coming in this sort of humble and gentle way. Third point about this goodness is that it's from above, but it comes in flesh and blood. And the incarnation, as we reflect on it over Christmas, the idea, think about the history of the Jewish people, right? No one of that time was more aggressively monotheistic than the Jews. All of the things that they had been taught about God and taught about each other were that there is one God above all, and God is separate from us. No one understood that better than the Jewish people. The idea that a God in flesh should appear there, happening among Jewish people, is really astonishing when you think about it in that sense. The idea that God departs from those ideal abstractions of completeness and order and being and distance to actually descend into our real lives, to feel what we feel and to touch what we touch, to hear what we hear, to suffer how we suffer, to die how we died. This is a much different kind of goodness than anyone had experienced before or was expecting. And there's something really compelling about that for our Christmas story. And then you have explicitly there with the announcement of the angels, this is good news for all the people. This isn't good news for just people who understand it, or for people who are waiting for it, or for people who happen to already be nice, for people who are a certain color, or a certain gender, or a certain age, or a certain personality. It's the exact opposite of that. And the goodness of something being truly flattening for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are in our lives, is again this goodness that we didn't expect, but once we encounter it, we're like, yeah, I recognize God's presence in that goodness. And then finally, I separated the question of goodness from truth today, because I thought that the question of whether Christianity is good is a different question from whether Christianity is true. But I think this goodness and how it's broadcast, it's like the light at the top of a lighthouse. Or it's like the star that's over the shepherds. Or it's like the blaze that's coming from the angels. This doesn't answer all the questions. This doesn't tell everybody everything they need to know, just that there's a star above us, right? You have to follow the star. You have to hear the angel. You have to dig deeper into what's the implication of this astonishing thing that you see happening. So in that way, the goodness of the incarnation serves as like a light at the top of a lighthouse. It gives us direction. It gives us connection. It gives us something to seek out and seek towards now that we know where the coastline is. And I think that ultimately that's the sense in which goodness actually comes first before truth for most of us, because for most of us it's going to be an encounter of Jesus people. That's going to be the first thing that's convincing in our lives, really deeply convincing about Christianity. Or it's going to be the love of other people lived out in community. That will be what's transformative for us. And the truth, in a sense, comes behind it, because the good is what really lands in our hearts. And so, as you celebrate Christmas this week, I think that it's an opportunity for us to celebrate just this incredible goodness that appears in the incarnation, and seeing that God's truth does good not only in the past, not only in the here and now, but in the future in this way that is humble and transformational and is not what we would have expected. So let's close in prayer. God, we are grateful for the shepherds, for the angels, for the people here in this story who were not expecting the good news. We're encouraged by that, God, because we often don't. God, we're encouraged that this good news is not a good news for the good people. It's not a good news for the people who are already nice. It's not a good news for just the people we like. It's the good news for everyone. And that is so humbling and so hopeful. And so we celebrate your birth and pray that this Christmas season will be one where we are deeply, deeply connected to your grace for us as expressed in that goodness. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.